For every 8 people who have been executed in the United States, 1 person has been found innocent and released. This statistic from the Equal Justice Initiative reveals a minimum of a 12% error in death penalty sentencing. I've always been aware that the US has a death penalty, as I'm sure we all are, but I never really thought about it much until last year when I read the book Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. This book opened my eyes to the reality of our criminal justice system. The death penalty is a highly debated topic with a very long history of origin. It can be traced all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, which was written in 1750 BC. This Babylonian legal document established punishments for 282 different crimes, 25 of which were punishable by death, including the crimes of adultery and aiding slaves, but surprisingly not murder. Capital punishment laws have taken many shapes and forms since then. It is estimated that around 72,000 people were executed in Great Britain during the reign of King Henry VIII, using methods such as boiling, burning at the stake, hanging, and beheading. In the early American colonies, you could be executed for anything from stealing grapes to killing chickens. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, or DPIC, there have been over 16,000 American executions since the European settlement of the United States. Laws surrounding the death penalty began changing far before the US became an independent nation. In 1682, the Quaker Code limited capital offenses in Pennsylvania to treason and premeditated murder. Many states have since outlawed capital punishment altogether. According to the DPIC, 29 states have officially abolished the death penalty or paused executions, and there are approximately 2,400 people on death row. In 2023, only 7 states gave out the death penalty, and only 5 actually followed through with executions. A recent Gallup poll shows that more than 50% of Americans today believe that the death penalty is given unfairly. But how do Christians view this topic? There are many references to capital punishment in the Bible, resulting in much debate among American Christians. Some believe that the death penalty is a biblical system of justice and that we should support it. Others would argue, including myself, that our system today is simply too corrupt. Today, I will outline 3 reasons that Christians should not support the death penalty, starting with the amount of error in the justice system, and then the effects of bias in the justice system, and finally, the immorality of the justice system. There is an extraordinary amount of human error that can be observed in U.S. courts, as many are aware. But when it comes to the death penalty, this issue is literally a matter of life or death. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, between the years 1977 and 2004, there were over 7,000 people placed on death row, of which about 13% were executed, while a whopping 37% were resentenced or exonerated. An exoneration is defined by Merriam-Webster as a complete clearance from an accusation or charge and from any attendant suspicion of blame or guilt. Bryan Stevenson, lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, has won 135 cases granting relief to wrongfully convicted prisoners on death row. Stevenson's most famous case is that of Walter McMillian, a man who was subject to an incredible amount of racial prejudice and police misconduct. As described in Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, the local officers bribed a convicted white felon into giving a false testimony against McMillian, withheld substantial evidence of his innocence, and illegally placed him on Alabama's death row a year before his trial. Let me highlight again that the only evidence they had against this man was the testimony of a convicted felon. After spending 6 years on death row, he was released but received minimal compensation, and the officials involved were never held responsible. In the U.S., police officials and prosecutors are protected by a law called the Immunity Law, in which the Supreme Court held, and I quote, that a prosecutor cannot be held liable for misconduct in a criminal case, even if he intentionally and illegally withheld evidence of innocence. How can we call a system in which our officers can intentionally sentence an innocent man to death a system of justice? Simple, we can't. The death penalty system relentlessly portrays the exact opposite of the one value it claims to uphold the most: justice. In fact, it behaves more like a murderer itself than a sovereign judge. In 2018 alone, 111 exonerations in the U.S. involved perjury or false accusations, 50 of which involved a crime that was never even committed, according to the EGI. 3 exonerations took place just last year, including a man named John Huffington, who was fully exonerated and released on January 13th. After spending over 40 years on death row, his attorneys proved that the forensic evidence used to prosecute him was obtained by unaccredited methods and was scientifically inaccurate. These types of errors are usually not accidental, but rather are the result of corruption and exploitation of specific groups of people, which leads me to my next point, bias. America's history of racial profiling is no secret. However, many fail to realize the gravity of it today. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, African Americans make up about 38.7% of the U.S. prison population, while only making up 12.2% of the country's population as a whole. Illegal and racially biased jury selections are often the determining factor in death penalty cases, such as in the case of a man named Curtis Flowers. Flowers was sentenced to death for an alleged murder after just a short 30-minute trial by a jury made up of 11 white men and only 1 black man. After spending 23 years on death row, all of his charges were dropped on a later appeal, and Flowers was awarded $500,000. Evidence also shows that people from poor backgrounds who cannot afford to hire a good lawyer are far more likely to receive the death sentence, because many public defenders fail to present all of the evidence to court. A good example of this type of case is Jimmy Doe. He had been involved in a violent drug deal in which he ended up firing his gun at another man. The victim was treated in the hospital but died 9 months later due to health complications coupled with stress. After the victim's death, the state changed Doe's charges from assault to murder. As Doe could not afford a lawyer, he was stuck with a public defender who failed to present his background trauma, the physical and sexual abuse he experienced as a child, his past drug addiction, or his severe intellectual disability to the court as evidence. The true cause of the victim's death was also never fully investigated. The state offered Doe a plea of 20 years, which he likely would have accepted had it not been for his lawyer's failure to explain the deal to him. Instead, Doe went to court and was executed by the state of Alabama on April 16, 2009. Reflecting on this case, Brian Stevenson writes these words: "The Supreme Court had banned the execution of people with an intellectual disability, but states like Alabama refused to assess in any honest way whether the condemned are disabled. We're supposed to sentence people fairly after fully considering their life circumstances, but instead, we exploit the inability of the poor to get the legal assistance that they need, all so we can kill them with less resistance." This reality shows that we are far from what God views as justice. The Bible tells us in Exodus 6 very clearly, "Do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty." My final point against the death penalty is that it is immoral from a biblical perspective. Many Christians support the use of the death penalty because it was a part of Mosaic law. But what they fail to realize is the category of law this falls under. In the Bible, there are 3 types of laws. There are ceremonial laws, which establish certain aspects of Hebrew culture, such as dietary restrictions, rituals, and hygiene. There are the moral laws, essentially what things are considered sinful in God's eyes. And finally, there are civil political laws, which are specific to the laws of the Israeli government in the Bible, including the death penalty. But we are no longer bound by these civil laws. In fact, there are tons of these laws in the Bible that we disregard entirely. No Christian that I know would ever say that it is just to execute someone for cursing at their mom or dad. But that's what the law of Moses says to do. Don't raise your hand, but just think how many of us here would already be dead if that were the case today. Jesus set us free from that law when he died on the cross for our sins, and we know this because of Romans 7:6. But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code. Of course, we are still commanded to obey our government, but only if they uphold God's everlasting moral laws, and the death penalty clearly does not. Additionally, Jesus' life on earth is a clear demonstration of God's mercy. He showed mercy to the adulteress who was to be stoned, to the thief hanging next to him on the cross, and to many more. Even in the Old Testament, we read the story of David, who committed not 1 but 2 capital crimes under the law of Moses, yet was spared by the Lord and even referred to as a man after God's own heart. Despite all of these facts, there are many Christians who still support the death penalty. They might argue that the death penalty is the only punishment fit for extreme criminals. Take, for instance, a mass murderer with no conscience who is killed repeatedly, is caught on camera, and is obviously guilty. While this argument is understandable, our system is already meant to be innocent until proven guilty, and yet innocent people are still condemned to death. So although these criminals do exist, is killing them really worth the cost of more innocent lives? Another argument to be made is that if we sentence murderers to life in prison instead of giving them the death sentence, that they will keep killing inside of prison. However, this fear is not realistic. Death rate statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Justice show that between 1980 and 2002, the number of homicidal deaths in prisons has decreased by 93%, accompanying the drastic decline of death penalties issued during this time. What this data essentially shows is that as less people have been sentenced to death, less people have been murdered in prison, not more. The Bureau's data also shows that inmates who have been in prison for over 5 years are far less likely to commit murder in prison than a newly convicted felon. Considering that prisoners are on the row for over 10 years before execution, it is clear that the death penalty isn't doing anything to protect other prisoners. If anything, these statistics show that homicides in prisons would actually decrease with the abolition of the death penalty. Additionally, there are biblical arguments that can be made in favor of the death penalty. A key scripture that is used in the pro-death penalty debate is Genesis 9:6, which states, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man." This verse may seem pretty cut and dry, but many theologians disagree on its meaning and application. Was it really establishing capital punishment for all time? Or was it only referring to the covenant between God and Noah? Was it truly giving man the authority over life and death? Or was it alluding to the authority of Jesus Christ in the second coming? Scriptures like this one must not be taken out of context, but rather must be analyzed with the Bible as a whole. The Bible clearly shows that God is the ultimate judge of whether we live or die. When Cain murdered Abel, God cursed him and made him a fugitive. However, he did not kill him. Yet in other instances, God destroys entire cities because of their sin, like Sodom and Gomorrah. Since we know very well that our government is not able to accurately and justly give out punishments, we should leave the matter of life and death to God. To conclude, Christians should not support the death penalty because of the error, bias, and immorality of the justice system. Although we see a biblical model of capital punishment in God's word, it is clear that our government is too corrupt, and always will be too corrupt, to follow that model without exploiting and murdering innocent people. So what should we do about it? God has a unique calling for every believer. Some are called to be community leaders, and some are not. The Christian leaders in our community should at the very least spread awareness of this issue and encourage other believers to recognize that it is serious. And as for the rest of us, we should use our right to vote to bring into power officials who seek to make a positive change. And finally, one thing that every Christian can and ought to do is pray. Pray for the well-being of our country, and pray for the release of wrongfully condemned prisoners. Thank you.
I'd like to make a couple comments as opposed to questions, because I think that I can serve you better by the comments than I can by a question. First of all, your work was outstanding. I too was greatly impacted by the book Just Mercy, and if anyone in this room has not read it, I strongly urge you to read it. I think it's a book that every person in this country should read. You made a very strong case for your thesis that we should not support the death system, the death penalty, because of the injustice of our our judicial system. And you did a great job on that. Second comment is kind of a two-part thing. One, we should never consider our papers as final. Okay, so you guys have all written really nice papers, and yet you are going to learn a lot more about each of these subjects as you grow, and you can come back and sharpen those things. Some of you in the class will remember when Mrs. Snyder read her book to you in first or second grade. That book was first written probably 30 years before she shared it with you, and it was rewritten and jettisoned, and just lots of changes, because over time you get more knowledge and you learn how to communicate it better. So if you're okay with it, and what I'd like to point out to you is something that I think could make your paper better. And if you'd like to discuss it more in depth with me, I'd be more than happy to do that. So in your thesis, you stated, both in your introduction and conclusion, that we should not support the death penalty in our country because of the errors, bias, and immorality of our justice system, particularly as it pertains to the death penalty. And in the first 2 points, the errors and bias of our judicial system, you clearly made your points. However, when it came to your third point, you strayed a bit from your thesis. As I said, your point 3 was the immorality of our justice system, but you got astray a bit and muddied the waters by talking about the immorality of the death penalty, which was not part of your thesis. One of the reasons there's a problem, other than straying from your thesis, is that there are a lot of people, learned people, who have solid biblical reasons for supporting the death penalty. The problem with that is that many of those people would not read a book like Just Mercy. They would not hear you. Once you got to sharing your view on the biblical view of the death penalty, they would just turn you off. Okay? So, but they need to hear it. What you have to say is so important. So if I were going to redo your paper, I would stick to your thesis on that, and I think it would make it stronger, and I think that it would allow people who may disagree about the death penalty to hear what you're saying about the injustice in the justice system.
Thank you.
Olivia, great job. That was extremely thorough and well written. You mentioned cases like Curtis Flowers and Jimmy Dill to illustrate racial and socioeconomic biases in death penalty sentencing. What specific reforms do you think could address these biases effectively?
Oh, I think jury selections could be better, and I think they are already getting better, but like cases like the one I mentioned where it's a black man on trial, but the jury is made up of predominantly white men, it's just clearly biased, and so I think just being a lot more careful about jury selections. And then I also think in cases for people who can't afford a good lawyer, I think, and that's understandable, and I think it is important to have public defenders, but I think there could possibly be more, and I don't personally know like how you become a public defender or the training that they go through, but just some way that to make sure that they are adequately representing their clients.
Thank you, and I just have one last question. Your thesis highlights the significant error rate in death penalty sentencing. What legal safeguards or changes would you propose to minimize wrongful convictions?
Specifically to the death penalty?
Yes. Specifically, individuals who are wrongfully convicted to the death penalty.
I mean, if they abolished it, that error rate would be 0. So that would be my proposition, personally. But if that weren't to happen, I think the numbers currently also have been going down a lot of how many people are currently being wrongfully convicted. It still happens, but definitely not as frequently as it was. I think the biggest issue is people who are currently on death row, who have been on death row for like 40 years, who like some of them just aren't supposed to be there, like they didn't do it. And so I think reopening those cases and really taking a deeper dive into whether or not they actually committed the crime.
Great job, thank you.
After reading this a couple times, I was struck by what happened in Alabama. And it renders the thought that there are some differences in how people see what it means to be a Christian. Alabama is said to be 90% a Christian state. And with that being the case, it's hard to hear that these things happen in a Christian state. That's just hard to hear. And so I'm going to ask you this question, and I think knowing you can give some feedback. But what is to be said about the state of Christianity if Alabama is deemed to be a Christian state? What is to be said about the state of Christianity if Alabama is deemed to be a Christian state and these things are happening?
That's a really good question. I didn't think about that question. I would say, that we're humans, and that, it's not right, but we all get it a little bit wrong. I think about this a lot, but I feel like every single Christian has their own very unique theological beliefs. Like every Christian that I've met believes a little bit differently on something, and not a single one of us has it completely right. And I just think when we go to heaven, we're just all going to be really humbled about how many things we got wrong. And so that's what I would say.
Not to keep you on the hot spot, Olivia, but we do have time for any more questions. If any one more question, anybody?
I was just going to add this. What can we do to show people in our country more of the love of Christ so that we can come to a common place as Christians? Maybe there's some things, especially youth, can do to show the love of Christ to others, even to other types of Christians, or people who may say they're Christian and may still say things that can be offensive to others. Like, are there some things that we can do to show the love of Christ to others who are Christians, that as a Christian you may say, I don't understand how you can stand for certain things?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if this is the answer that you were looking for, but that made me think about social media. And I think since you mentioned younger people and younger Christians, I think it's really easy to be one type of Christian person and another type of Christian online and over social media. So I think that's one area that a lot of us could really improve on, is how we present ourselves and our faith over social media.